Prince of the City tells the story of Daniel Cielo, a police detective who agrees to inform on the corrupt dealings of law enforcement as long as he doesn't have to implicate any of his partners who he refuses to give up. This is directed by Sidney Lumet, who less than a decade earlier directed Serpico, also about a solo police officer fighting corruption, so it's hard not to compare the two movies. Daniel Cielo is a much less heroic figure than Frank Serpico, and we see his story play out less in terms of abstract rights and wrongs and more of how it affects him and his relationships on a personal level. This version of the story is more complex and less black and white overall, as so much of the corruption is clearly not just a matter of greed, but is passionately defended as the only way to save the city in a world where corruption elsewhere allows the bad guys to wriggle out. Is it better to use corrupt methods against them yourself in the name of the greater good? This is something the film touches on in a very interesting way, and I found myself thinking longer and harder about these questions after this film than I did Serpico. It's definitely worth a watch if you like crime movies at all. The Formula is a political crime thriller starring George C. Scott as a former detective called in to help solve the death of his former boss and mentor. His investigation leads him overseas to find a mysterious synthetic fuel formula confiscated from Germany after World War II. This is one of those movies where you spend most of your time trying to remember which lead led where and how the person who just showed up for 3 minutes and gave them another name to talk to is connected to the original mystery. A lot of films can get away with this by having these characters make strong impressions or by providing a strong thematic through line to keep you on track, but this film doesn't really offer either. It dances around a bunch of narrative arcs, such as the relationship Scott's character has with his son, or the one he builds with the niece of one of the men he's investigating, but these are not dropped so much as just forgotten. It feels like it's just being complicated for the sake of being complicated, like that's what makes a movie good, but by the time it gets to the end, not only have we lost track of who's who, we don't really care anymore. Kodachrome stars Jason Sudeikis as a man who has been estranged from his father for decades, only for that father to contact him with news that he's dying. The father, played by Ed Harris, asks his son for a favor, to travel with him and his nurse, played by Elizabeth Olsen, to develop his last rolls of Kodachrome film before it stops being processed forever. Sudeikis reluctantly agrees, and the three of them set out on the road. These are very familiar beats being played out here. It's a well-worn story, and there are no surprises to it, really. We know exactly how it's all going to play out, and it does so competently, so evaluating the story here isn't really the point. Instead, we're relying solely on the acting performances to carry the movie, and it largely works. Jason Sudeikis always holds his own as a dramatic actor, a subtle one, capable of speaking his dialogue in a dry tone full of hidden depths of meaning. Olsen and Harris don't bring quite as much nuance to the table, but they're still good and convey effectively the complex relationships at play here. Movies don't need to be wholly original, they just need to make you think or care about the characters, and this accomplishes that. To Live is a Chinese film following one family through the rise of the Chinese Communist Party and the Cultural Revolution. As the world changes around them, the family works hard to stay together and stay safe, with varying degrees of success over several decades. This is one of those films that successfully showcases the personal side of big historical events. Enormous shifts in the culture are happening, but the movie stays narrowed in on how this family in particular is making it work. So we see the father's work as an entertainer, sometimes valued greatly, sometimes not at all. We see people in charge willing to bend the rules to make sure the people they love are taken care of. It's a moving story that somehow never feels melodramatic, even when dramatic things happen, and I think that's partly due to the pragmatic responses from the characters. They mourn and they celebrate, but at the end of the day, they go back to living their lives the way that they live them now. I'm having trouble putting into words all the things that I liked about this movie, and I think that that's because it's one of those films that sits in my heart more than in my head, and I'm sure the more that it sits there, the more that my thoughts on it will gel. The Villain is a Western comedy starring Anne Margaret as a woman tasked with transporting a large sum of money for her father, Arnold Schwarzenegger as the noble cowboy who escorts her home, and Kirk Douglas as the villainous thief trying to retrieve that money for himself. This is a thoroughly bizarre movie, primarily because it is clearly a tribute to the Looney Tunes characters of Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, played here by Douglas and Schwarzenegger respectively. And when I say tribute, I mean they play the Looney Tunes theme at the end. I mean Douglas paints a giant tunnel on a mountain which Schwarzenegger then drives his wagon through. It is basically just a live-action Roadrunner cartoon. And while you'd think that'd be a lot of fun, it sadly mostly doesn't work. The jokes are nearly all pretty flat, there's some very uncomfortable scenes of redface, and the ending is, I'd say, nearly incomprehensible. But it's kind of a marvel this thing exists at all, and considering I went in knowing nothing about it and thought it was just a typical Western, it definitely yielded some surprise shrieks of delight when I realized what it was going for, even if it doesn't meet the high bar it sets for itself. Twins is a comedy where the central conceit is that Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger are twin brothers. The two were the product of a reproduction experiment intended to create the perfect human, which was then mostly abandoned, leaving one child to an orphanage and one to a researcher who raised him on a remote tropical island. When Schwarzenegger learns he has a twin brother, he sets out to find him, and then, if possible, their parents. For being mostly a one-joke idea, this is executed much better than I anticipated. The two actors are playing to their strengths here, playing up not just their physical differences, but giving them different personalities as well, with Schwarzenegger playing the sweet, naive brother who just wants to bond with his family, and DeVito playing the jaded criminal who doesn't trust anyone. Watching them interact and explore their fraternal relationship is entertaining enough that when a criminal deal gone wrong subplot appears in the second half of the film, it feels unnecessary, like a very obvious ploy to move along a story that was moving just fine on its own. Still an enjoyable second half, but it is noticeably a means to an end. I don't know that I'll rewatch this anytime soon, but I'm glad I saw it. End of Days stars Arnold Schwarzenegger as a bodyguard who chases down someone who attacked one of his clients, only to end up in the middle of a bizarre situation where the devil is attempting to conceive a child with a human woman to bring about the end of the world. Schwarzenegger tries to protect the woman from both the devil and the priests who want to kill her to stop the apocalypse from happening. This movie is absolutely ridiculous, but not in a fun or interesting way. The woman being protected is an extremely poorly written character with no agency or personality whatsoever. The camera work frequently relies on unjustified shaky shots that made me a little sick for no good reason, as well as way too fast to be useful editing. The film is hilariously confused on whether firearms are or are not effective weapons against Satan, because while they want him to be beyond the reach of mere mortals, you can't not have your action hero coming in with guns a-blazing. Even with the script attempts to be mildly thoughtful, such as the flashback to the protagonist's family when they were alive, is muddled by the script's unclear motivations. This film is a hot mess, and a boring one to boot. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night is an Iranian vampire western about a female vampire and a young man with a drug-addicted father whose lives overlap. I don't want to go into too much detail, although to be honest, that probably wouldn't hurt the movie, because it isn't a plot-centric movie. It's all about the cinematic atmosphere being created, and wow, is it a haunting one. This film moves slowly and deliberately through its world, and that meant it frequently took me by surprise by how intense I found it. I'd be vaguely bored with these long, slow shots of characters sitting sadly, and then all of a sudden I'd realize I was terrified, or deeply sad, or some other big emotion. Anna Lily Amirpour's directorial choices really crept up on me. Aside from the cinematography, the score is also startlingly impactful. It's never what I would have expected as a film score for any particular scene, but it always set the mood perfectly. A lot of times I find that films relying this heavily on film language can become predictable for me, but I genuinely never knew where this film was taking me, and I loved that. This is one that is going to sit with me for quite some time, I'm sure. Bells Are Ringing is a musical romantic comedy starring Judy Holliday as a young woman who works at an answering service, taking other people's phone messages and relaying them back to them. However, she continuously gets in trouble for taking too personal an interest in her clients' lives and stepping in to give them help they don't ask for, especially in the case of Moody Playwright, played by Dean Martin. I knew one or two of the tunes from the show before watching, but really didn't know the plot or most of the score at all, and I found myself very pleasantly surprised. It's light and funny and heartwarming, and many of the songs are much more interesting than your typical classical musical sound. The only song that didn't fully land for me was the big ensemble number at a party, and I suspect that's because the story's magic comes from the individual performances. The star here is undoubtedly Judy Holliday, whose charm didn't quite sell me during Born Yesterday, but she just delights me here. She somehow manages to be both blissfully dreamy and pragmatically down to earth. If you're a fan of Golden Age musicals, this is one to watch. Prisoners tells the story of two young girls who go missing and how it affects the people around them. The film focuses in on one girl's father, played by Hugh Jackman, and the detective on the case, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. Jackman becomes convinced that one of the suspects Gyllenhaal released knows the truth about the girls, and he takes matters into his own hands. This is very much a film that relies on its audience to put things together. My husband and I had a long conversation afterward in which we found we had very different takes on what the film was trying to say, simply because our own biases and beliefs made either scenario possible, and the several reviews I read afterward were all split on whether the film condoned or condemned torture as a means to an end. Additionally, director Denis Villeneuve frequently cuts a scene before showing what we know is going to happen and moves on to the next bit, and remembering how often he uses that technique makes the film's possibly ambiguous ending much less so. The audience is expected to fill in the gaps. On a pure storytelling level, I found the film deeply thrilling despite its slow pace. It's a film I suspect I will have to continue sitting with to really appreciate it fully. The Lords of Salem is a horror movie by Rob Zombie about Heidi, a DJ in Salem, Massachusetts, who gets a mysterious record delivered to her at the radio station one day. Playing it, however, has a strange effect on her and many of the other women in the town. Rob Zombie's aesthetic is not mine. There are a lot of pieces of this that have some great ideas, and several of the scenes involving the record itself are genuinely creepy, but for the most part it's not scary so much as just grimy and occasionally silly. There's a gleeful earnestness with which Zombie tosses subverted Christian symbols into the movie, but they seldom make any sense. They just feel like they were put there by someone convinced that was enough to be edgy and creepy. But no, just showing me an image of a nun or a weird shape around a cross isn't a big deal. Maybe for other people it is, but to me it feels like so many of these images were thrown together haphazardly. Like we're watching Rob Zombie's mood board on Pinterest and he decided to film it all. It drowns out an otherwise unsettling story by feeling, honestly, just, yeah, kinda silly. Pal Joey is a Rodgers and Hart musical about a notorious womanizer named Joey, played here by Frank Sinatra, who finds himself caught between two women, an ambitious nightclub singer, played by Kim Novak, and a rich widow, played by Rita Hayworth. Most of the film is just him flirting back and forth between these two women before being nudged into a deeper commitment like 2/3 of the way through. I've been enjoying a lot of classic musical movies recently, but this one doesn't work for me much at all. I attribute that partly to how uninteresting the story is. Joey's an unpleasant character, and I don't particularly care who he ends up with. But this movie also features primarily diegetic numbers, sung by the characters at the nightclub where they work. This nearly always severs the emotional connection for me between the music and the story, though you can get away with it if the story is rich enough, like in Cabaret or Once. Pal Joey's story is not rich enough to stand up to that. So even though there are some good individual musical moments, none of them strengthen or are strengthened by the narrative, and it all ends up falling a little flat. Elle stars Isabelle Huppert as a woman whose father went to jail for murdering several people when she was a child. Now as an adult, she has a strained relationship with her family and law enforcement, so when an intruder breaks into her apartment and rapes her, she is hesitant to go to the police and instead takes it upon herself to find out who he is. Isabelle Huppert got an Oscar nomination for her work here, and it is well deserved. She conveys so much with so little, these subtle movements that suddenly tell us so much about what's going on inside her. The narrative itself is tricky to sort out. While I think that on the whole it's done well and thoughtfully in a way that gives Huppert's character a lot of agency and depth, I do sort of raise my eyebrow at this kind of story being written and directed solely by men. It doesn't automatically disqualify it for me, but it means I hold it a little bit at arm's length, and am a little less sure I like it than I was at first. It makes me wonder how much of its story is meant to be tantalizing instead of thought-provoking. Huppert's work deserves recognition, but I'm still parsing out how much recognition the film deserves on its own. A Week Away is a Netflix jukebox musical featuring mostly songs from late 90s, early 2000s contemporary Christian artists such as Stephen Curtis Chapman, Michael W. Smith, and Amy Grant. The plot itself is about a teenager who was given the option to attend a summer camp program instead of juvie after stealing a cop car, and the people he meets there who change his life. Well, sort of. This is a surprisingly non-specific and non-preachy Christian movie, which does make it an easier watch, but also makes it very difficult to track a character arc, since it hints at Christian epiphanies, but won't actually say any of them out loud. The CCM musical numbers are everything I wanted them to be, enormous and cheesy and awkwardly choreographed and full of nostalgia for me. I wanted more of them, though. The few newer songs and original tunes didn't fit the vibe nearly as well, and since I was really only watching this for the nostalgia, I missed having more. Besides, how do you do a 90s CCM jukebox musical at a youth group camp and not include Friends by Michael W. Smith? Overall, neither as bad nor as fun as I wanted it to be. More knockoff camp rock than Facing the Giants. The Magnificent Seven is a 1960s Western retelling of the Akira Kurosawa movie Seven Samurai. It features 7 cowboys who are hired to protect a small Mexican farm village from a bandit who routinely takes their harvest for himself. The job doesn't pay enough to be worth it for most hired guns, so the 7 that agree to it are a mixed bunch with all kinds of different motivations. I found Seven Samurai far more captivating than I expected to, and to my delight, that was my reaction to The Magnificent Seven as well. The film gives us just enough information about our main characters to keep us interested throughout, and then watching them interact with the villagers they're protecting is captivating. After all that build-up, the final scenes are mostly typical Western shootout and are less interesting than everything before, but fortunately that's only a small piece of the story, and I appreciate that it also makes space for some very thoughtful philosophical discussions of what it means for these men to be in this profession and what they gain by it and sacrifice for it. Overall, a very carefully and intelligently crafted film, and definitely worth a watch.